The topic of my presentation is fantasy sport consumption segmentation, which entails an investigation into the differing consumption modes of fantasy football participants. Those who aren't familiar, a fantasy sport is a type of online game where participants assemble imaginary or virtual teams of real players of a professional sport. These teams compete based on statistical performance of those players in actual games. Sport fandom is one of the preeminent leisure activities in our society today. According to the Fantasy Sport Trade Association, nearly 30 million people over the age of 12 play fantasy sports within the United States and Canada. Additionally, the FSTA estimates $80 million is spent directly on fantasy sports products and services each year, while an additional $3.5 billion is spent in media production and services related to the activity. In this study, there were two research questions. The first is, among fantasy football participants, do differing high-low mixes of fantasy team and favorite NFL team consumption identify distinct modes of NFL media consumption behavior? The second is, based on these modes of behavior, are there any social, attitudinal, or additional consumption behaviors, attendance-related and mediated, that differ significantly across the modes? The reason for investigating further into these research questions is rather simple. The NFL and others have overlooked fantasy sports as an actual interest in the game that could compete with the former platforms with which consumers invested the majority of their time and money. Sports and entertainment are two of the top 3 visited sites on the web, and fantasy sports are one of the fastest growing facets. According to researchers Pritchard and Funk, media-dominant consumers were more likely to purchase team-related merchandise, view media advertising and promotions, and are as involved in the sport as heavy consumers. With this being said, the research questions once answered will give us better insight into what exactly is happening with fantasy football participants and their behavior toward facets of the sports as a whole, as well as insight into where college students fit into the demographic of sports media. In an attempt to create an understanding around these topics, Brandon Dwyer and Joris Dreyer did qualitative research containing several different studies. Using this information, they were able to develop a structure through surveying 2 of the most popular fantasy sites with 12 mediated sports consumption items. After developing the proper research design, Dwyer and Dreyer ended up with 306 respondents who completed the questionnaire and were of age. There were 4 sections that these participants would be placed into: light consumer, fantasy team dominant consumer, favorite team dominant consumer, and heavy consumers. The demographic of majority of participants were 95% male, 72% were less than 35 years of age, 75% of participants had some type of college education. Dwyer and Dreyer found, with regards to the first research question, that differing high-low mixes of fantasy team and favorite NFL team consumption identify distinct modes of NFL media consumption behavior. For the fantasy-dominant consumers, they found that they would use more media for their team than favorite team-dominant consumers would use for their favorite team. This was a major finding because it shows that fantasy-dominant consumers use more media and are more an asset to the NFL. They even found that the heavy consumers used more hours of media for their fantasy team over their favorite team. All of this is telling the NFL that they need to market toward fantasy areas that still include live games, and more importantly, As for the second research question, they found that there are social, attitudinal, and additional consumption behaviors that differ significantly across the modes. The results show that fantasy dominant and heavy consumers were practically identical in their behaviors, while light consumers and favorite team dominant required less media consumption in all aspects. This means that fantasy dominant consumers are just as important as heavy consumers, and the aspect of media needed. When we take a step back from all of this information, it seems to paint a clear picture that fantasy consumers are becoming the most important consumer to the industry, and 75% of these consumers are college educated. This puts our demographic of being college students directly in the crosshairs, which means the NFL and fantasy websites will be targeting the internet much more to accumulate more viewership and interest. Marketing is or will be the main focus on us, so be ready.